of helplessness and deep shame and embarrassment, exhaustion and hopelessness. The people had nowhere to turn. They didn't know what resources were out there. For many, even if they found the courage, expensive therapy and private mental health centers were out of the question. Even those who managed to get psychiatric care, healing takes time. So there was a tremendous need in the home to be able to provide the right sense of reinforcement for the family to be able to manage through their daily lives. Unfortunately, the system here in Israel is a complex maze. Hospitals and organizations will turn people away because they're not considered immediately suicidal enough or dangerous enough. So we decided we had to start an organization to help many people suffering in silence. In a discussion with Fran Zakobowitz, my wife, Judy, found out that Fran and her husband, Saul, were also planning to build a similar organization. So we joined forces and launched Avnei Chein. Together with the Jacobowitzes, we assembled a great team. We have Jenny Kranis, who you may see here, Yossi Wachdel, Gail Gundel, and a growing list of volunteers and mentors. We worked hard as a team to put the pieces together: rabbinical advisors, mental health professionals, months of research and working relationships with a long list of mental health services. It did not take long for Avnei Chein to find ourselves very busy with a growing list of people in need. I also want at this point to thank those both friends of our family, the Green family, and friends of the Jacobowitzes, who were very generous in contributing at this early stage to get us started. So let me just give you a very quick overview of what Avnei Chein does, right? First of all, there's a time of crisis. It could be 3 o'clock in the morning and we hear of a victim who is in trouble. And we run over there and try to select the best resources for them. Perhaps it's the police, it could be Hatzalah, a psychiatric hospital or therapeutic center, or wherever else we think will help them at the time of the emergency. We don't just leave them, we don't just serve as a transportation service and deliver them to the hospital and say goodbye. We hold their hand through the trauma and continue until they're in a state of stability. Meanwhile, the other side of the equation is that we're there for the whole family. Often overlooked, kids are traumatized by repeatedly seeing members of the family, especially parents, lose control or go through several panic attacks or psychotic episodes. We therefore provide ongoing support. We now have a network of volunteers providing meals to alleviate the pressure in the home, emotional support. Just as a quick example of emotional support, my wife got a call from a woman who was in a supermarket and was having a panic attack. So she dashed over there to the supermarket. She got in the car and drove behind her, drove her home. And once she was in her home environment, she was fine. This type of emotional support is something we're making a major point to try to be able to provide for people. We also have Big Brother program, Big Sister programs, tutoring and more. We then continue to use our connections to a wide range of services to help the victims and families navigate the complex mental health systems so they get the financial support and treatment they need without falling between the cracks. We continue to work with them until we see that they're in a healthy place of stability. So if you're suffering, be brave and reach out to us for help. If you're a rabbi and people are coming to you with mental health issues, encourage them to contact us. If you're a mental health professional, let's say a therapist, we can help the family, even though you're helping them on a therapeutic level. Curing takes time. So there's a tremendous amount of support of the family that's needed, and we're here there to help. And if you want to volunteer to make meals or other ways to help, please contact us via our website, avneichein.org. And of course, donations are always welcome and can be made on the website. Now, now I would like to introduce Rabbi Tatz. Although he doesn't need an introduction, I will mention that Rabbi Dr. Tatz founded the Jerusalem Medical Ethics Forum, of which he is the director. For decades, he's been one of the most popular lecturers and profound writers on a wide range of Jewish issues. Recently, I tried to watch a Zoom class of his on vaccines, The 500 capacity room was completely full, so I had to watch it on a recording. I also was told that today's class is Le'ula Nishmas Miriam Rachel Bet Moshe. So please welcome Rabbi Dr. Tatz.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Can people hear me? Could raise your hand, do a little jig, dance up and down. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your initiative to help people with mental health issues. And we have great admiration for people doing your work, and so I'm very pleased to be able to add something to your initiative. Let me ask you to keep yourself muted if you don't mind, just so I don't get feedback. I'm very happy to hear if you have any questions on your chat, or you're welcome to email me afterwards. Not sure we'll have time for discussion, but let me try to build a picture of the free will issue and try to spell out for you how it applies to mental health issues as well. How many people on this session are therapists or people involved in actually helping people? Any professionals among us? Okay, I see we have quite a number of people. Try to show you the centrality of the issue of free will in mental health issues. I'm talking here, you mentioned schizophrenia and the more heavy end of mental health issues, but I'd like to try to cover the whole range, emphasizing more perhaps the ones that are more, let's call them functional, obsessive issues and adjustment problems, but I try to show an insight into the whole field, particularly important for therapists. And I'd like to do that by way of analyzing the question of free will as deeply as we can as a Torah subject. And I think as we go along, it'll become clear to you where this fits into the spectrum of helping people with mental health issues, and I'll try to spell that out as well. But if you look in many systems of mental health assisting, I'm not sure what model you use, perhaps you're eclectic and use different models, but if you look at innate health or 12-step programs, you'll see, even though there may be a theme of surrender, giving yourself up, a religious attitude to a greater or lesser degree in 12 steps, there's always the issue of taking control where you can. And I'd like to try to explain how that works and counter a prevailing attitude that it's not your fault and there's nothing you can do about it. It may not be your fault when you have a mental health issue, but there's almost always something you can do about it. And I think part of a therapist's role is to show the person they're working with, I don't know whether you call them a client or a patient or whatever you call them, but the person you're helping needs to be guided towards taking control where they can. Let me try to explain what I mean by virtue of going through the subject of free will at root, if I may. At the very least, you will learn how to speak English correctly. So let's move towards Purim with a Torah subject and try to show its unique application to the world of mental health. And mental health, I'd also like to include people who not defined as mental health issues, but could use improvement in the handling of their lives, become better adjusted people, and move towards great achievement where they might have been only considering mediocrity before. Are we together on that? Is that okay? Yes, David, can you hear me? Okay, I don't want to get fired before I begin. Free will, what we call Bechira, defines the human being. If you'd like some references on this subject, I wrote a book about this recently that's called Will, Freedom, and Destiny. This is the book. Why not do a little self-promotion? Will, Freedom, and Destiny. And you'll find all the classic areas of free will discussed here based on the teachings of Rav Moshe Shapira, including the difficult subjects of foreknowledge and free will, and many others. But one of the central themes will be something relevant to mental health. And I'll try to speak out what it is. First of all, free will defines a human being. That's fundamental to understand. I did not say Jew, I said human. At the root of the human condition is the ability to choose for yourself. And that's what defines us. If you want to put this in formal Torah terminology, we would say that the human being is created b'tselem Elokim. Tselem means a divine image. And of course, the question is, what does it mean to be created in a divine image? And many of our commentaries, like the Meshech Chochmah and the Sforno before him, they point out that Tselem Elokim means free will. Free will. Where you represent or you resemble Hashem is that you have free will. He does what he wants unconstrained by any limitations, and you can do what you want unconstrained by any limitations in certain proportion. What defines you as divinely modeled is your free will. That's what's unique about you. Creatures above us, like angels, do not have free will. They see too much and they see too clearly. Creatures beneath us, like animals, have no free will. They see too little. Amazingly, human beings have free will because we are created at the interface between an animal world beneath us and an angelic world above. We are sandwiched at an interface. Beneath us is an animal world that sees only the immediate earthy and material world. Above us is an angelic world that sees the spiritual world with total clarity. We are pitched at the interface between the two. We feel the pull towards the earthy, the material, the lecherous, the animalistic. Not you Jews living in Beit Shemesh. I'm sure you're on a prophetic level of angelic purity. But normal human beings, that's what they feel. On the other hand, we also feel the pull towards the angelic and the noble and the conscience-driven. And in that zone of tension lives free will. Which will be dominant? Will you answer to the call of the lower and have the neshama pull down to the material? Or will you answer the call of the higher and have the material pull to the angelic? That's free will. Technically, if you're interested in Kabbalah, it's called the Ruach. The Ruach can opt to be pulled down towards the Nefesh or up towards the Neshama. That's the function of Ruach, which is that intermediate zone between the two layers of the human being. That's what's unique about us. Animals are in the lower zone, angels in the higher zone. An angel has the sort of free will that you have to walk into a fire. Do you have free will to walk into a fire? Well, theoretically, yes, but you see the consequence so clearly, you would not do it. Do you have free will to jump off a tall building? Well, theoretically you could, but you see yourself becoming part of the scenery, so clearly that you wouldn't do it. When you see clearly enough, your free will is almost completely constrained. Only because you live in the zone of darkness and here a sensitive ear begins to hear Purim. Purim is the theme of living in doubt. Having a mask of a reality and not seeing their essence clearly and learning to see through that mask. Amazingly and ironically, we have free will because we live in the darkness. We see an inkling of the spiritual, we see a clear vision of the material, and because we live in that zone of electric tension between the two, we have free will. That is there's a most beautiful expression of this. The Medrash Rabbah says that before the human being was created, before Adam was created, Hashem said, Na'aseh Adam. Na'aseh Adam, let us create the human. And the Medrash asked the obvious question, why would Hashem express himself in the plural? Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Why would Hashem express himself? Na'aseh Adam. And it gives many wonderful answers. But listen to this one. It says, before Hashem created Adam, he consulted his angelic powers, his midas, truth and justice and virtue and charity. He consulted those, the agencies that he wanted to assemble into a human. Shall I create man or not? Some said create him and some said do not. Truth said do not create humans, they'll be full of lies. Stocker said create humans, they'll give charity. And while these cosmic forces became locked in an irresolvable conflict, while they were arguing each other, some saying create man and some saying do not create man, while they were arguing, God created the human being. The childish misunderstanding is that because they could not resolve the conflict, Hashem ignored them and created the human being anyway. That's not correct. The correct interpretation is this. God asked for their advice and he took it. What was their advice? An almighty unresolved conflict, and that's what he created. The human being, anyone involved in psychology needs to know this. You are the battlefield between warring motivations. You don't have to have a mental health problem for that. The definition of a human being is the battlefield between conflicting emotions. You want to get away with you can and cut corners and do things that are immoral at some level. On the other hand, you'd like to live up to the angelic standard as well. And that is the definition of the human being, is the tension between the two. That's the background to free will. So far, so good. Are we together? Yes? No? Yes? Good? Okay. Now, let's take the next step. Our free will is seriously constrained. I would say constrained horizontally and vertically. Horizontally, I mean, look at all the areas of your life, your marriage, your financial situation, your academic achievements, your health. Look at all the zones of your life. It's axiomatic in Jewish teaching that you are free in only one of those. You have freedom of will in one area only. And that area, I'm sure you know, is the ethical and the moral. The choice to be good and not bad. That's where free will operates. It's a fundamental principle in Judaism to know that when we talk about free will, we talk about choosing to be good and not choosing to be bad. That's where free will is predicated. Take, for example, money. Do you have free will when it comes to finance? No. Our teaching is very clear that on the first day of Rosh Hashanah every year, your finances are determined for the year. You cannot make 1 cent more than is predetermined at the beginning of the year. You can destroy yourself financially without limit. That's certainly within your free will. That's irresponsible. That's a moral failure. That's a dereliction of responsibility, and there's no limit to how much you can destroy yourself financially. But no matter what you do, you cannot earn more than, not 1 penny more than is predetermined at Rosh Hashanah. That's not amenable to, I'm giving general rules here, but that's the concept. I don't think you need me to tell you this. Look around the world, you will see people who are very smart, very well educated, always make the right decisions and never make any money, and others who are total idiots and very rich. I happen to know a few, I can assure you. There's no connection. There's no connection between the two. And therefore, I saw a very interesting, David, you said you have some Canadians here. I saw an interview with Mr. Bronfman. Bronfman is a Canadian Jew, is a multi-zillionaire, owns half of Canada. So the interviewer said to Mr. Bronfman, how did you get so wealthy? He said, when I was 10 years old, I bought an apple for 1 cent and I sold it for 2 cents. Then I bought 2 apples and I sold them for 4 cents. Then I bought a box of apples and I sold them for $1. Then my grandfather died and left me $61 million. And that's how I became. He's right, Mr. Bronfman. You make your effort, the money doesn't necessarily come from there. And therefore, we do not assert free will when it comes to finance. Let's talk about health. I happen to be a doctor, but you don't need to be a doctor to know that your health is not amenable to free will. That means you can do all the right health moves and eat the right diet and exercise perfectly and become disastrously ill. You can destroy your health. Absolutely. That's a dereliction of moral duty. You could kill yourself. There's no limit to how much you can destroy yourself, health-wise. That is in the moral zone, but you cannot guarantee good health, no matter what you do. That's not amenable. How long you live, by the way, according to Kabbalah, is not amenable to your free will. It's a gift you're given when you're born. You're not made aware of what that length of time is. You cannot exceed by 1 hair's breadth what's called your kates, your end point in life. You can lose time, absolutely. You can speak Lashon Hara, says the Rambam, you lose life. Not paying a worker on time, you can lose life, and you can regain life. For example, helping a bride or a young couple get married, you can add back life. Tshuva can do that, but you cannot exceed the God-given endpoint, just like history cannot exceed its hidden gates. So all these areas are non-amenable. What about marriage, for example? Even marriage choices are very seriously constrained. A young man cannot possibly explore a relationship with every woman on earth, even though many young men seem to try very seriously. But be that as it may, you are limited in your options when it comes to marriage choices. And that is our view of life, is that the circumstances of your life are very seriously constrained. Where you're not constrained is your moral response. How do you handle those situations? Within your constraints, and here we come to the first mental health issue. Within your constraints, you are charged with using your free will. No matter what those constraints are, they may be extremely constraining, but in your zone of constraint, within your definition, within your area of freedom, no matter what that is or how small that is, that's where you get to express yourself, and that's where you're judged, and that's where you define yourself as a human being. Let's talk about the vertical scale. This makes it even clearer. And what I'd like to share with you is an insight into the famous teaching of Rabbi Dr, which is called Nekudat HaBechira. And this is worth a very, very serious effort to grasp clearly, because all of Torah depends on this principle, and mental health issues depend totally on this principle. And that is called the point of free will, Nekudat HaBechira. Stay with me carefully. It's hard to think of anything more important than this. This is the most classic notion we have in this whole area, and arguably in all of Jewish hashkafa, perhaps this is the most important thing. Most exquisitely expressed in the writings of Rav Dessler, but once you see it everywhere. And here's what he says. On a vertical scale, you are free at any point in your life and in any spectrum of your life, any area of your life, at one point on a vertical scale at any time in your life. Below that point, things are so vulgar and crude, you would never get them wrong. And above that point, things are so spiritual and so refined, you wouldn't get them right. They're too difficult for you. Your free will is expressed at your level of challenge. Beneath you, it's easy, and there's no credit for overcoming those ordeals, and you do that easily. Above you, things are too difficult, and you get no punishment. There's no spiritual damage for failing in those areas. They're too difficult for you. You're not operating at that point yet. Again, there's a point of freedom. Now, listen well. Where's the point of freedom? That depends on you. Let me give you an example. Let's take, the Gemara says one of our daily temptations is some or other form of theft, in a very broad understanding. Let's take that. Imagine a vertical scale. What's at the lowest point on the vertical scale? The most vulgar and crude and violent and uncouth level? That's a young fellow who hangs out on the street, violently mugging little old ladies. That's all he does, hits them on the head with a brick and he takes their money and runs away. Where's that young man's point of freedom expressed? Listen carefully. Says Rav Dessler, the next time that young man attacks a frail victim, and instead of killing her, decides only to crack her skull, he has done a tremendous mitzvah, achieved a tremendous elevation in his point of freedom, and he will be rewarded in the next world for that. Now, to you, that's unthinkable. I mean, I don't know you people personally, but you strike me as the types who probably not hanging out on the street most days, mugging little old ladies by hitting them with a brick, I imagine. That's unthinkable to you, but for him, it's real. Why he's operating at that point, we'll have to discuss. That's another discussion, but he is. He's only to be expected to assert his free will in the context that he finds himself in. If his context is violence on the streets, how he got into that we'll have to discuss. But if that's his present context, his free will is expressed in that context. And when he avoids mugging a little old lady with violence, he gets the same credit that you do for a supreme spiritual achievement, maybe more. Again, it's an amazing thought. Let's take this a little bit further. This means, for example, that all of you that I see on my screen in front of me, you're all guilty of theft at your level. So you're thinking to yourself, gee, what does he mean? I don't break into people's houses at night with a black mask and a crowbar. I mean, at your level. Please raise your hand if you've ever had a job working for someone else. Anyone? Okay. You're sitting there working for someone, and while you're working in the office, you make a private phone call. 2 counts of theft against you. Your employer paid for the call. And secondly, the 10 minutes you spent speaking to your mother, you've been paid a salary. What do you mean you don't steal? You mean you don't hit people on the street with a brick and take their money, but it's actionable theft just as badly for you as it is for him. And you judge that seriously for that. Okay, if you live in a place where it's tacitly accepted that you could make a private phone call occasionally, maybe. How about long distance? How about half an hour on the phone? How about coming a little late to work or leaving a little early or not working as hard as you could? That's theft. And you being judged at your level, okay, let's say you would never do that. You would never take such liberties. Let's go a little higher. There's a thing called Gnevas Das. Do you know what Gnevas Das means? It means theft of the mind. What's that? That means when you mislead someone in a very subtle fashion and no harm is done at all. But it's a dishonesty. It's called theft of the mind, and it's considered theft in halacha, and you're as guilty as the man on the street taking money. It's very refined. You need to be on a sensitive spiritual level for that. But if you're operating at that level, that's where your theft is actionable. Example, you're sitting down to dinner, you're about to open a bottle of expensive wine. Unexpectedly, a friend of yours walks in. You say to your friend, you know what, I'm going to open this wine in your honor. Lying through your teeth. Gnevas Das. Now, no harm was done. On the contrary, honored him. But it's dishonest and there's an element of theft. You go to hospital and you visit someone who's ill. On your way out, you notice somebody else who's in the hospital that you didn't know was there. So you walk into the room and you say, hi, I came especially to visit you. You're lying through your teeth. It's called Gnevas Das. It's totally awesome. You did a mitzvah too. That's another question. And by the way, the din is, if the person says to you before you open your mouth, gee, thanks for coming to visit me especially, you don't have to disabuse them of that notion. You can remain silent. You don't have to tell them that you didn't. But you may not mislead them into that. That's called Gnevas Das. That's called theft. You're being judged in the area of theft at your level of refinement. David, I'm sure you allow me to set a homework challenge for your audience. Here's a question that was asked of Rav Zilberstein some time ago. Real question. Gnevas Das. See if you can answer it. A fellow walked into a bank in New York and he said to the bank manager, I'd like to borrow money. So the manager said, yeah, we do loans. How much do you want? So the fellow said, I want $200. I'm going abroad for 3 months. I want $200. The manager said, are you serious? $200 is a tiny loan. You're going to pay 20% interest. I mean, what is this? He said, look, you advertise loans. So the manager said, okay. He pulled out the forms, started filling in the forms. And when they came to collateral, the manager said, look, you got to leave us some security. The guy said, look, my car's in your parking lot. It's worth a lot more than $200. Here are the keys. I'm going abroad. I don't need it. Impound my car. When I come back from my vacation, if I fail to pay the loan, you can sell my car. Manager said, fine, great, no problem. And that's exactly what happened. Fellow went abroad for 3 months with his $200, came back, walked into the manager's office, paid $240 and left. Manager called him back and he said, what was all that about? Guy said to the manager, where else could I get parking for 3 months for $40? Now the question is that Gnevas Das? On the one hand, total deception. On the other hand, he took a loan, he left security, he paid interest. That's a very interesting halachic question. But that's a question at a high enough level of spiritual refinement. If you told that story to the fellow on the street mugging people, he'd think that's too wonderful. Why didn't I think of that? He wouldn't see the moral problem. Are we making some progress, gentlemen, ladies? You're being tested at your level of refinement. That's called Nekudat HaBechira. You're operating at a point of freedom. And that's where you're being tested. Things beneath that you wouldn't get wrong. You're not going to walk into people's houses and take their money in the middle of the night or hit people over the head. On the other hand, are you conscious of the value of every word? Do you know every word you say has a Jewish standard? Every word you ever say has to be completely true, completely kind, and completely necessary. Please raise your hand if you can honestly say that every word you've ever said is completely true, completely kind, completely necessary. But if you're on a high enough spiritual level, that's where you're being judged. And therefore, if you want to know how you're doing, how are you operating at your point of freedom? Listen to this. Somebody with a serious mental health problem may be doing better than you. They may be a better adjusted human being dealing with their situation than you are with yours. And if you're a therapist, that's your job. Your job is to find for them what cannot be changed in their circumstances and show them what they can change within their circumstances. And that's their responsibility. And then no holds barred on that. By the way, being a parent has the same duty. You, as a parent, when you're dealing with a difficult child, you have a teenager who's going off, acting out, being problematic. What's your job as a parent? Your job is to insist on absolutely everything you can get away with and win, and turn a blind eye to the things that you cannot. It's out of their point of freedom. As a parent, you're going to gain nothing by asserting discipline where you're just going to be disobeyed. All you do is lose authority. You turn a blind eye to that because you have to. But it doesn't mean you have to give up your authority in areas where you maintain authority and where you can have a say and where you can lay down a law and it'll be obeyed. Your job is to define the zone of freedom, and that's where you challenge people. I hope I'm making sense here and you begin to see the application. When you're a therapist and you tell your client that it's not their fault and there's nothing they can do and it's society's fault and they're a victim, you're killing them. Your job as a therapist or a parent or a teacher or a friend or a spouse is to show the person you're working with where their zone of freedom is and what they can maximize in their circumstances. The rest is not their problem. Now, Simcha Wasserman once said, I was very close to him. He once said, my brother-in-law, who was his doctor, Dr. Bortz from Telston, he was his doctor. He asked us, Simcha Wasserman, how do you manage such joy always? He scintillated with joy. He lived a life of unmitigated tragedy, childless and family wiped out during the war. And he sparkled with joy. He said, how does the Rav manage such joy always? Rav Simcha said to him, looked at him with those amazing blue eyes. He said to him, every situation I find myself in, I ask what can be done. Whatever can be done, I do. Whatever cannot be done, do not worry about. It's not my problem. That's his problem. The question is, are you doing what you can? Most of us, of course, we don't do what we should and we worry. But that's the wrong formula. The formula is to define what can be done and do it. That's your job. What cannot be done, not your problem. You got a genetic problem or a mental health issue that's not amenable, that's his problem. But what can you do? That's where your zone of responsibility is. Let's take the next step. This point of freedom is not static, says Rav Dessler. Every time you assert it correctly, you shift it, you move it. When you make a free will choice that's correct at your point of freedom, you elevate it. And the next thing is you get given a harder test. When you pick up weights in the gym, you build muscle. Tomorrow you've got to pick up heavier weights. The point of freedom, when you assert your freedom correctly and you make a free choice that is correct, the next thing Hashem does is send you a harder test. But you're a more mighty warrior. And the point of life is to keep sophisticating and elevating your point of freedom. You know, if you're a tennis player, anyone play tennis? No one plays tennis here. Oh, good. Okay, good. If you're a tennis player, you'll know that tennis is meaningful only against an opponent who's more or less on your level. That's called tennis. More or less on your level. If you play somebody way beneath you, let's say you're a good club player, not like David, I'm sure he's an excellent club player. And you know, you can beat the best people in your club. You walk out onto the court one day and you find you've been challenged by a 2-year-old. Kid walks out there with his diaper and his racket, you know. Let's say you win. Is that meaningful? No. Yes, technically your name goes up, but it's irrelevant. On the other hand, let's say you play the world champion and during the entire match, you never see the ball once. Would you tell your mother you lost? No, you didn't lose. You didn't play. Tennis is meaningful against somebody more or less on your level. When you beat somebody way beneath you, it's not a victory. And when you succumb to somebody way above you, it's not a defeat. Is this clear? You are pitched in battle with your own lower self. And that's where you're asserting yourself. And when you overcome, when you beat the people in your club, then you have to play the other club champions. And when you can beat them, you have to play the national people. And when you can beat them, you have to play on the international circuit. And the warriors become more mighty enemies, but you're a more mighty adversary. When you play, When you fight in the world heavyweight division, if you win, there's $1 million in it. But if you lose, you get your jaw broken. That's the rule. You're asserting your point of. Rav Dessler has the most memorable analogy. He says the point of free will is like two countries at war. The entire nations are at war, but the pain and conflict is felt only on the front line where the tension is taking place. That's where the battle's taking place. And as one country advances, one army advances, conquered territory becomes quiet. There are no battles there anymore. And if there are no battles, there's no more reward. When you pick up trivial weights in the gym that were once a challenge for you, you build no muscle with that. You know, I work in Kickoff. I'm sure you all do. I certainly hope you all do. I work in Kickoff. I work in London. Imagine a young man walks into our institution, the JLE, fine Kickoff institution, and he starts learning about Judaism for the first time. 3 weeks later, goes out for lunch, is about to cross the street into the local seafood deli, shrimp, crab, lobster boiled alive. He loves that food. Next door is the kosher deli. Doesn't like that food at all. But something speaks to him and he stands there saying to himself, you're a Jewish boy, non-kosher food desensitizes you. Stands there shaking and sweating for half an hour and chooses a kosher lunch. Tremendous growth. A spiritual value has overcome a temptation. Next day, the battle doesn't last as long. And 3 weeks later, when he finds himself eating kosher food automatically, no more reward, no more battle. That part of the battle has been overcome. He's fighting more mighty adversaries, and that's become part of his repertoire, there's always the legacy reward for the work that he put in. But if there's no more battle, no more exertion, there's no more growth. You need to pick up heavier weights as your muscles grow. And therefore the point of freedom is always moving. And that's the point of escalating your point of freedom and to keep conquering new territory and new levels of challenge. Okay, I hope this is clear. By the way, this means you can never compare yourself to anyone else. You can never compare yourself there because you need to know their point of freedom, right? In order to know how they're doing. How do we know this? The Gemara says that in the next world, you see no one else from one perspective. You see no one else. Not actually 100% true because husband and wife are bonded into each other for all of eternity. It's good news for some of us, a little distressing for others, but that's another point. But be that as it may, that's why you should try to marry somebody you like. But again, that's a second point. But in that world, you see what you are and what you could have been. You see what you are, stripped of all facade and illusion, and what you could have been. Your standard of comparison is what you could have been. You don't see anybody else. Well, Chon Wasserman says this, explaining the Rambam. Everybody can be as great as Moses, as Moshe Rabbeinu. What does he mean? He achieved 99% of his potential. If you achieve 99% of yours, you're judged equal to him. What more can Hashem ask of you? And therefore, you cannot compare yourself to anyone else. You can only compare yourself to what you could have been and should have been. That's your standard. Children in the classroom, by the way. Children in the classroom. Do you know that in authentic Jewish school, the teacher never reads out grades in the class? You read out grades in the class, you make one child feel inferior to another. Maybe that child was more gifted, this child less gifted. Absolutely not. If you'd ever like to be heartbroken, let's say you feel like being depressed, go to a primary school prize giving. You know, there's a little sea of expectant faces and they start giving out the prizes. They always give all the prizes to one obnoxious, abnormal child who probably had his brain irradiated when he was a fetus. And that kid gets all the prizes. And sitting next to him is a little 7-year-old whose heart is breaking because he'd give anything to come home with a prize. And he's not going to get one. And that's not Jewish education. That's assassination. They've all got to get prizes. When they're 15 years old, you can be brutally unfair. Life's unfair. Children have to learn. But not when you're 7 or 8 or 9 years old and don't understand that. The standard of comparison, the reason you give a test to children in the classroom is to call the child over and to say, for you, that result's not good enough. But you compare to somebody else? How ridiculous is that? Hashem doesn't compare you to other people. He compares to you to what you should have been. Okay, so far so good. Now let's take the next step. Why are you operating where you're operating? Why is that young fellow on the street mugging little old people and grappling with that issue, and you grappling with an extra word of kindness or sensitivity, or joining David's organization where you help people who are in distress at 3 o'clock in the morning, like he said? Why? And the answer is, it may not be your fault, or it may not be your credit. This is an amazing thing to understand, and it's fundamental. That young man on the street, he may be in that situation because of circumstances beyond his control. Maybe he was put into that situation or born into it. Listen carefully. You're not accountable for where your point of freedom is. You're only accountable for what you do at your point of freedom. And your point of freedom is determined by things beyond your control. It's also determined by your previous choices, but determined by your teachers, your parents, your circumstances, your genetics, your chemistry, and Hashem. And that you're not accountable for. Listen carefully. You can accuse everyone else for your point of freedom. You can accuse your parents and your teachers and Hashem himself, but you cannot accuse anybody else for how you function at your point of freedom. And that's what a child needs to be taught. And that's what a person with a mental health issue needs to be taught. You may not be responsible for your mental health issue. That may be, you can turn to Hashem and blame him for that. But what are you doing at your point of freedom? Where's your freedom of will expressed where it is possible for you to express it? You know, we see this in many ways. And it's a scary thing, Rav Dessler. You know, your friend walks past you in the morning and your friend needs a kind word and you're a little preoccupied and you don't greet them. And they get upset and depressed because of that. And because of that, they have a bad day and they do bad things. And the bad things lead to other bad things. And the whole thing amplifies. And a long string of disasters. It's all your fault. The responsibility goes back to the point of freedom, where free will was expressed and it has consequences upon consequences. Let me give you an example. You know, once we're frightening ourselves, we might as well terrify ourselves. So let me tell you this. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the books of the living and the dead are opened. The books of the living and the dead, all human neshamas are judged on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The Mekubalim ask this question: why would Hashem judge the neshamas of the dead? They can't be different than they were year before. Here's a person who dies. Hashem judges his neshama. Next year again. Why? In the space of a year during which a person has been dead, there's no mitzvahs and no averos. All you can do is coast with the momentum that you built up in life. Why is a new assessment necessary at the end of a year in the spiritual world for a person who's been dead all year? And the answer is amazing and very scary. The reason is because during this year that they've been dead, many things are playing out in the world as consequence of something they did that when they were alive. And that's theirs. And here's a person who had a child and then he died. But the child had children and the children had children. Now there's 3,784 great-great-grandchildren in the world. And all that all of them are doing is accruing to the credit of the person who began the process. Scary. So you teach someone a value. You help someone with a mental health issue. You raise a child with spiritual values, and the child propagates those values to the extent that they do it because of your teaching, not because of their freedom of will. The credit's yours, not theirs. The consequences, the collateral issues that go on and on and on, they go back to where the free will effort was made. And you see it so clearly. Listen to this story. Listen to this story. I know a person. I met this person in South Africa, came to buy diamonds, a Hasidic Jew from Brooklyn. He came to buy diamonds in South Africa. I'm telling you a personal story. This is not hearsay. I know the person. Any of you know Selwyn Ziskin? Ask him. It was his partner. The man's name was Laser Wolf. He came to South Africa to buy diamonds. Listen to the story. His mother was pregnant in the Warsaw Ghetto just before the Germans killed everyone. And she needed to see a doctor. She managed to escape from the ghetto. And she went to see a Christian, a Catholic lady doctor from the old Polish aristocracy in the city of Warsaw. This Christian lady treated the Jewish patient, and when she was about to leave, the doctor said to her, if you go back into the Jewish ghetto, do you know what's going to happen to you? The Germans were closing in. So she said, yes, I know. She said, come and stay with me. So the lady said, I cannot leave my husband. She said, bring your husband as well. The lady said, but I cannot leave my family. She said, bring your family as well. The Jewish woman went back into the ghetto and told her husband that this Christian lady was offering to save their lives. So the husband said, but I cannot leave my family. So they took them as well. They arrived at this lady's door with 13 people. She put them in the attic of her house for 22 months, including a time during which the Gestapo occupied the house. And for 22 months, she kept them fed and clean. There was no bathroom. There was no water. She fed them and carried away their waste with her own hands, kept them clean and alive for 22 months with Germans in the house. 22 months later, she managed to get them across the border through Switzerland. They all survived, all 13. Amazing stuff happened. And all 13 of them ended up in New York City. A few years ago in New York, there was a wedding of one of the grandchildren of one of those 13 people. And at that wedding, there were 200 people present, descended from the 13 people that she saved 80 years before. And they went back to Poland to find her, and they brought her to be present. Her old lady, to sit in Brooklyn, to seeing 200 people dance around her at a Jewish wedding, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of 13 people that she saved. And during the meal, someone walked up to her and said to her, why did you risk your life to save Jews? She drew herself up to a full, frail height, and she said, because I read the Bible. And in Genesis, I saw that when God was about to wipe out Sodom, Abraham negotiated with God. And he said to God, if you can find 50 righteous people, will you save the city? And God said yes. 45 righteous people, and God said yes. And she said, I was hoping that there'd be enough of us to save Poland. And I was wrong. Now, those are all her children. and the children's children are her children. You do an act in the world and it has consequences, and the consequences have consequences. And she just died a couple of years ago, this lady. So you do something in the world and you propagate a value and you teach something, or you've found something, or you establish something in the world, and it has ongoing consequences to the extent that the momentum of what you did, it's yours. And therefore, here's the message. You may raise a child. You raise a child in Ramat Beit Shemesh. This child is a Jewishly educated, morally superior, refined, unbelievable child. Does the child get any credit for that? Zero. You know who gets the credit? You. The child has to make an improvement in their circumstances to get spiritual reward. And if you bring a child into the world abused and abandoned and beaten and at very low level, does the child get punished for that in any way? No, you do. The child gets only asserts their spirituality and their free will at their level of freedom. And therefore, your starting point in life may not be your fault. It may be, but it may not be. That's called the Nekudas HaBechira, where you're operating. And your job in the world is to assess your Nekudas HaBechira clearly and function correctly at that point of freedom. I hope I'm making myself clear. But that is the classic teaching of Rav Dessler. And this is an authentic Jewish view. And it runs throughout the Torah. It runs through. You cannot begin to approach Torah without knowing this. How did the greats of the Torah sin? How did they sin? We have an incredible paradox in Torah. People of supreme spirituality, close to perfection, they performed the most heinous sins. King David, virtually perfect, 2 mistakes his entire life, but they were murder and adultery. What does that mean? The answer is King David committed those sins at his level of spirituality. At his level, he's held accountable like that. And the Torah makes no bars, no holes, no limits to that. At your level, he's being accused. Had you been there, you wouldn't have perceived the sin. 2 famous brain surgeons operating, famous professors of brain surgery. And there's a first-year medical student looking into the head of the brain, trying to figure out what they're doing. At a critical moment in surgery, one professor cuts a nerve that's 0.5 millimeter thick. Disastrous. And the other professor says, idiot. And the medical student says, yeah, you jerk. What a chutzpah. What a chutzpah. When Hashem accuses David HaMelech of a sinner, you call him a sinner? The Gemara says, if anyone who says David sinned is making a mistake. At his level, any sin in Torah is a sin predicated at a cosmic level of Bechira. And at that level, it's 100% accountable. There's no question about it. He made a mistake, that professor. But at his level, without the concept of Nekudas HaBechira, you can't begin understanding Torah. And therefore, running throughout all of human understanding and all of therapy and all of Torah and all of Jewish history is the concept of Nekudas HaBechira. Let me take a moment, if I may. David, am I speaking too long? I'm happy to. Let me add, if I may, something critically important. Many of you in therapy, you help people, you have a secular training, a psychological education, which is seriously wrong in at least one point. And let me try to express this. Modern psychology, the pendulum has swung towards the position that we're not responsible. We're functions of our genes and our education and our chemistry and our circumstances and our influences. And that's the teaching, and therefore nothing's your fault. Nothing's your fault, and it may not even deeply be changeable. Nothing could be further from the truth in Judaism, and yet there's an element of truth to that. Let me explain what I mean. I have a friend who's a psychiatrist. Some time ago, he said to me, "Can you please speak to me about one of his patients?" Okay. Why do you want to talk to me? I'm not a psychiatrist. Here's the question. Here's a 21-year-old Jewish girl who has a problem that she steals candy in the supermarket. That's what she does. She's fine in every other way. She's a rich girl, by the way. She has a house full of candy she can afford. She has a tremendous compulsion to steal candy in the supermarket. What's the problem? She's now in court for the 10th time. And the judge is asking my friend to testify to her sanity. He's a psychiatrist. If he tells the judge that she's legally insane, she will go for psychiatric assessment. If he tells the judge that she's legally sane, she'll go to jail. This is a 10th offense, and she may die there. You're talking about a naive, sweet, innocent girl in a South African jail. Very dangerous. And my friend says, what am I going to tell the judge? I can't tell the judge that she's legally insane. The legal definition of insanity is psychotic detachment from reality. She's not like that. She knows what she's doing. She comes from treatment. She usually controls herself. What am I going to say? Now listen carefully, ladies and gentlemen. What do we say as a Jewish approach to that question? The girl has kleptomania. Is it genetic? Is it chemical? We don't know. But it's real. It's real. Now, what do we say? Do we say that the girl's not accountable and she's not legally accountable because she has kleptomania? It's not her fault at all? If so, which criminal is accountable for the actions altogether? They'll say, you don't understand the compulsions. It's my compulsions. It's if you see me with one of my problems, I don't steal candy in the supermarket, I can assure you. I've got other issues. But if you see me with one of my issues, Tatz, why are you out of control with chocolate cake? I say, you don't understand the compulsions. It's not me, it's my genetics, it's my chemistry. You see, if we lay the blame on genetics and chemistry, then no one's responsible for anything. On the other hand, we know genetics and chemistry are real. Are we going to say the girl should be acquitted because she's got kleptomania, she's not responsible? But then anybody will tell him uncontrollable compulsions. And if we say, no, the girl's 100% responsible, she should be jailed. She's responsible for her actions. That's obviously ridiculous. She has kleptomania. You don't. I hope I'm showing you the dilemma here. Let me give you another example. Some years ago, there was a classic case in New York. I don't want to get into analysis of the case because it's been just as a model. A few young men from the Harlem ghetto attacked a young lady who was jogging through Central Park in New York City. It was a famous case. They almost killed her. They broke every bone in her body, but they never stole anything. It was a Sunday afternoon, and when the police found them, they told the police they did it for fun. For fun, they almost killed this girl for fun. Okay. The case came to trial in New York. Now listen carefully. The defense lawyers argued that the reason these young men should be acquitted is because they were raised in the Harlem ghetto. They were so beaten and abandoned and brutalized and poverty-stricken with no role models and no education that what they did was appropriate for their social circumstances. Now think about that for a moment. If you accept that claim that they're not responsible for their crime because of their sociological circumstances, then which criminal's accountable for their crime? Everybody can put it down to the circumstances and the genes and the education and the chemistry. And if you say, gee, that can't be right, they're 100% accountable, the brutal backdown is irrelevant. That's dumb. Obviously it's irrelevant. Obviously irrelevant. The fact that you don't hang out in the park most days, hitting girls with pieces of lead piping, I assume, in Ramat Beit Shemesh. You weren't raised like that. So here's our dilemma, and it's a hot topic in sociological debate today. How much of our responsibility is attributable to our chemistry and our genes and our background and our education? How do you define that balance? Please listen carefully, especially those of you who are therapists, and particularly those of you who had a secular psychological education. Here's the Jewish answer to that. When modern psychology teaches you that genes and chemistry and social influences and what you saw when you were 4 and what your mother said when you were 5, that those things are relevant, they're 100% correct, totally correct. Those influences are 100% relevant. Do you know what they do? They set your point of freedom. But what you do at your point of freedom, that's up to you. Again, they go too far. They say it sets your point of freedom and determines your actions at that point. We say no. We say that genes and chemistry and family and background and what, that stuff is relevant. What does it do? Determines the zone of your point of freedom. But what you do at your point, let me make this as plain as I can. Girl walks into the store, sees the candy. Is that her fault? No, that's kleptomania. But when she reaches out and takes the candy, when she could not have, she's guilty. Assuming she could have controlled it. I'm making an assumption here. When the young man stands in the park and the girl jogs through the park and the one guy says to the other one, hey, dude, or whatever they say, let's go beat up that girl. The other guy says, yeah, man. Is that their fault? No. That's how you think when you're raised in those brutal circumstances. But when they walk over and beat her up knowing they wouldn't like to have their bones broken, they're guilty. Again, what you're dealing with is not your fault, may not be your fault. It may be the fault of your life circumstances and your genes and your chemistry and your education. That's true. A mental health issue may not be within the control of the individual, but within that mental health situation, there's a zone of freedom. There may not be, by the way. There may not be. There may be an obsessive problem beyond control. And then there's no accountability, and then there's no legal accountability either. So there's a red line. A child, a person with temporal lobe epilepsy, a person with uncontrollable, there's no freedom. There may be none. And then you have a functional challenge. And then you have a legal, and by the way, the Meshech Chochmah says there's a level above which there's no freedom of will either. He says, Moshe Rabbeinu get to a level where there was no freedom. He couldn't go wrong after that. When you reach that level, let me know, David. But within that zone, and of course the real difficulty is at the red line is a gray zone where it's not clear. That's the problem. And that's where Das Torah comes in and psychological maturity to understand that may not be clear. Rav Zilberstein told us once that a 13-year-old boy with Down syndrome boy, went to see Rav Elyashiv, walked into Rav Elyashiv's room and he said to him, Rabbi, I've come to ask you to tell my father to let me have a bar mitzvah. I want to read the Torah like everybody else. My father says, no, you're not normal. You can't read the Torah. Tell my father I'm capable of reading the Torah for the community like every other 13-year-old boy. Rabbi Yossi said to the child, how did you get here? The boy said, I took a 13 bus from Bnei Brak to the main bus station. I took a number 1 to Jerusalem. And then I took a number 25 to come and see you. He said, tell your father that's good enough. That's good enough. You know, there's a question of judgment. So there's a gray zone and it requires judgment. That's true. And they may be difficult. But the principle here, the principle is that there is a point of freedom. All right, I think I've been speaking long enough. There's another depth to the subject, which I'm not going to go into. I just mentioned to you. Here's where we get a mystical question. David, you permit me another 3 minutes? There's a mystical question here. What happens at the point of freedom? For those of you who'd like a little bit of a challenge here. What I've said up to now, I think is perfectly logical. You don't have to agree with me. I wouldn't be stubborn about it. This is Rav Dessler's classic teaching. And you can see the construction here and the elegance of this structure. But then there's a mystical element, a Kabbalistic element. What happens at the point of freedom? When that girl faces the candy and she's making a decision, when you come to that fork in the road of moral and immoral, what explains the choice itself? I'm not asking you what explains the temptation on both sides, the moral urge on the one side and the illicit urge on the other. I understand that. That's your point of freedom. What determines which choice you make? And the answer is nothing. That's you. That's your point of freedom. Listen to how Moshe Shapiro put it, unbelievably exquisite. He said that everything Hashem does, we do. Everything that Hashem does is projected into our world. One of the things that Hashem does is yesh me'ayin. He creates something from nothing. Where do we create something from nothing? Every free choice. When you originate a choice to go right instead of going left, where does that come from? From you. If it came from anything prior, it wouldn't be free will. If you chose right over left, moral over immoral, because of something that happened before, you couldn't be held accountable. Free will means you originate the choice in yourself. That's Tzelem Elokim. That's a divine capacity. And therefore, not there is no explanation for it. That's who you are. And furthermore, it leads to amazing paradoxes. I'll leave you with just one thought. You know how paradoxical this is? Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, it's a point of unity. You can only choose one thing at a time. You can be faced with 2 tempting options, but you can only choose one at a time, and it doesn't matter which one that is. Here's what I mean. Stay with me carefully, I'll finish with this. Imagine you have 2 options. One psychologically very powerful, and one psychologically very weak. One motivation, massively powerful motivation, and the other one trivial. Let me ask you a question. Imagine a person poised at a fork in the road. One option attracts them tremendously powerfully emotionally. The other one is a trivial attraction. If you think they will follow the powerful motivation, please raise your hand. If you answer yes, you've denied free will. Here's a metal object, strong magnet, weak magnet. Object moves towards a strong magnet. Human being, strong motivation, weak motivation, moves to, that's not free will, that's mechanics. Free will means you can have a strong motivation on the one hand, a trivial one on the other, and you can choose the trivial motivation. It must be that way, otherwise you're denying free will. I see some perplexed faces. Let me prove it to you. Watch carefully. I'll show you somebody in an ordeal. One side attracts them very powerfully. One is a pathetic, ridiculous, trivial nothing, and I'll show you people succumbing to the trivial attraction. Are you ready? Ever tried dieting? Here's how it works. On the one hand is a powerful attraction, how you want to be, how you want to look, next summer on the Frum Beach, relationships, your life, massive attraction. On the other hand is a little chocolate wedge thing with a bit of cream and a cherry, 10 seconds of pleasure during which you'll feel like an idiot. But how can you compare those? One is a massive life motivation, one is a ridiculous, childish nothing. And a minute later, you're looking at a plate that is licked clean, like and don't tell me that was the stronger motivation. After you've done it, you say, I didn't do that, but I fall for that. How do people do this? I know at the moment you chose it was the stronger motivation. I know that, but you allowed that to happen. How did you allow that to happen? You know, I'll tell you an experience I had that brought this home to me with ultimate clarity. I was a junior intern in surgery when I had a patient with Berger's disease. I'll never forget this. Berger's disease is an exquisite genetic susceptibility to the nicotine in cigarette smoke. People who have this disease, if they smoke, their blood vessels close down. First their fingers fall off, then their hands fall off. Every vascular surgeon has patients like this. This was a 45-year-old highly intelligent engineer with 4 black toes that we had to cut off that day. Heavy smoker. This man knew that if he carried on smoking, we'd have to cut his leg off. He knew more about the disease than we did. He carried on smoking heavily, and 3 weeks later, we were obliged to do an above-knee amputation. The next time I saw him, I was a senior intern in surgery, and I noticed them wheeling him down the hospital corridor one day in a wheelchair with no legs, smoking on his way to losing an arm. People do that. When I mentioned this to a group of vascular surgeons in New York, one of them told me that he had a patient like this. When he lost his second arm, had his friends rig up some wire on the wheelchair so he could carry on smoking. Now let's just get the choice clear. Strong motivation, weak motivation. Man says to himself, what is my choice? Cigarette or leg? Cigarette, leg. Leg, leg, man, husband, father, walk, leg, or 30 seconds of pleasure during which you'll feel the cold hand of death? How could you get that wrong? How could you get that wrong? The answer is, you choose. Free will is a point of choice, and 2 motivations make their presentations. And the one side makes the presentation, try me, and you fantasize. Then you fantasize about the other side. Doesn't matter whether it's strong or weak, the chocolate, the weight, it doesn't matter what it is. You fantasize, and then sooner or later you open the gate to one of them, whichever one it is. Can be weak or strong, makes no difference. When it gets in, that's all you are. If you light the fuse of an explosive with a little match or a massive flamethrower, it makes no difference. Once you hit that switch, it goes. Rabbi Miller from Gateshead used to put it like this. I see a few South Africans in my audience. They will relate to this very well. Mr. Schumann, I know you know what I'm talking about. You go to Cape Town for a swim. Cape Town has 2 beaches. On one beach, the water is deliciously warm. On the other beach, the water is ridiculously cold, like life-threatening, dangerous, freezing. So you go for a swim, you put your foot in, freezing, 2 toes fall off, unbelievable cold. I'm not swimming here. But you look around, all your friends are watching you. You came a long way for the swim. You keep going, sidle until an ankle cracks. Eventually a kneecap disintegrates, like cold. Eventually you get to a point where the water's like around waist deep. After that, there's no going slow, just too painful. So you say to yourself, I'm just going right under that water. And then you say, just get me out of here. What is the result of that tension? As the 2 speak to you, paralysis. You don't go up and down, up and down. You stand there thinking about it. The one side says to you, just go down, you probably won't die. The other side says, just get out of here. And you can fantasize about those 2 for a long time. And eventually, you just go down. And people could commit suicide that way. Doesn't matter which one you choose. That's free will. You open the gate to the one that you want. It could be life-asserting, powerful, sensible, or it can be ridiculous and trivial. But when you let it in, that's all you are. The Gemara puts it like this. The Gemara says, when you choose correctly, you choose. When you choose wrongly, you allow yourself an instant of temporary insanity. That's called ruach shlus. And in that moment, you let it get in, and then you say, damn, could I do that? But you did it, and that's free will. Anyway, David and Judy, thank you for this opportunity to study. I hope the theme here of mental health has come through clearly. There's a range of mental health issues. There's a clear issues above and below red lines where people have no freedom of will. That'll be recognized legally as well. But within the zone of mental health issues, well within that zone, there are people who will have more ordeals at one time and less ordeals at another. They're beyond free will at one time and within free will at another. And your role as a teacher or a therapist or whoever you are is to help the person see clearly what can be changed, what cannot be changed, not default. No point beating somebody up and making them feel guilt about stuff that is chemical and genetic and functional, but to help them take responsibility for what they can. And the path to becoming a well-adjusted person and the path to maximizing your potential in the world is to grasp what you can change and not to sweat the stuff that you can't change. Happiness is the result of knowing what you cannot deal with and dropping that, and knowing what you can deal with and making the change. To make the change where you can results in a well-adjusted human being, and it results in a happy human being. Right? And you may be doing better with your mental health issue, coping with it, than some other more privileged individual without an issue who's not doing as well with their life circumstances that you are. A deep education in this theory, Rabbi Dr.'s point of freedom, is a very empowering point indeed. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I wish you great success with your project. And Mr. Shem will get to a point soon where everybody's going to be totally well adjusted.
Wow, thank you so much, Rabbi Tatz, for for speaking to us, especially all of us who are so interested in this topic. I do understand that there's some people who have some questions. Are you available to answer some questions? I'm not hearing you here for some reason. Jenny, you want to forward?
Do you want me to read them off from the chat?
Sure.
Give me a second. I'll see what's on the chat box. So somebody's asking about those people who beat up the girl, whether it was within or without their zone of freedom. That may be a hard call to make. In other words, if you can argue that something is beyond a person's limits of choice, if you can, then indeed they'll be acquitted spiritually, morally, and legally as well. Right? You can argue whether kleptomania goes beyond the bounds of possibility of I wouldn't be stubborn about that. If you can show that, then indeed. And I said that may be difficult for a court to decide, difficult for the Torah to decide. Addiction. Let's deal with addiction. Addiction does not mean you have no free will. Addiction means your point of freedom is shifted. That means you will have an ordeal with this drug that someone else doesn't. It's above your point of freedom for you who do not grapple with it, and it's within the zone of freedom for somebody who does. Addiction doesn't mean that the drug forces itself on you. It may, by the way, addiction may get to a point. You know, Rabbeinu Kreskas, you look in my book on free will, you'll see this. Rabbeinu Kreskas, writing in the 14th century, says an amazing thing. He says, very little that we do is amenable to free will. Very little that we do. Even our deepest spiritual moves may be the indirect consequences of a choice we made a long time ago. A long time ago. This person might have got into addiction through an immature decision a long time ago, and now they're beyond their point of freedom. Indeed, it may well be. Or there may be a slight modification they can make to become a little less addicted. But in general, the principle of addiction means, again, there's a range of possibility. Addiction can be so bad that it's beyond control. By the way, I've seen people resist heroin, never mind cigarettes, and almost die in an act of self-control of overcoming that. It may well be within the zone of freedom. It may need a lot of help. But the general approach we have to addictions, by the way, an addictive personality may not be a choice either. There are some people who clearly have a chemical disposition that leads them into certain types of behaviors, whether it's addictive or others. It may well be. But the challenge for such a person is, are you taking the steps to deal with it where you are vulnerable? And are you maximizing and are you making, for some people, the method is not to deal with the issue, but to avoid the issue in the first place. Let me add this, it's a very important point. The Gemara says, here's a man traveling down a road. David, stay with me, this is worth understanding. Here's a man traveling down a road, and he comes to a fork. The one road takes him safely home. The other one takes him past a river where women are washing and they're immodestly exposed. So the man says to himself, well, which road shall I take? If I take the safe road home, I just get home. Let me take the road where the ladies are and not look. I'm in the world to assert my free will, right? That's what Hashem created me for. He takes the road where the women are and does not look. Says the Gemara, he's a wicked man. Why? Because the test was not will you look or not. The test was which road will you take? You see, this man's trying to be dramatic. The Torah doesn't say thou shalt be dramatic. Imagine there's a road, two roads. One has a poisonous cobra poised to strike. What idiot takes the road with a snake to see if he can duck and dodge the snake? Stay out of danger. You're a bottle of poison. Let's put it on the table next to the wine to see if we can remember to drink them. What are you doing? Don't play with fire. Here's the first rule of free will. Don't engage your free will in the first place. Don't put yourself in the situation of ordeal in the first place. You won't be asserting yourself and showing your personal courage, but you'll get more reward for. The Gemara is teaching you that when there are two forks in the road, take the fork without the test. This is the real test. What was the first test of a human being ever? Hashem didn't ask Adam to do something. He asked him not to. Don't amplify your free will and put yourself into a zone of temptation. Don't get into the confusion of that tree in which you can no longer tell good from bad. Stay out of it. And man said, you want me not to assert my freedom of will? It just be a passive traveler, a passive passenger? The sacrifice of ego that you assert when you choose the option with no ordeal is a far more mature choice. And therefore, the path in life, and to guide young people, put yourself in healthier situations in the first place. If you put yourselves in spiritually unhealthy situations, even if you win all those battles, you shouldn't have been there. And I hope that's a clear answer. Another question, does a mentally ill person does not acknowledge his illness have freedom of will? Well, how do you know? How do you know? Are they in denial like most of us are in one way or another? Then indeed they are. Can you help them to see that there's an issue that they can deal with? If you can, you should. Or they may be beyond a point of option. They may not have insight. Some mental health situations deprive people of insight. and in which case they are not accountable. There's no general rule. Somebody's asking me, what about intuition? Not sure what the question means. If you mean professional intuition as a therapist, that means you get a feel about a person you're dealing with. Of course, you need to use that. A professional develops a sense of professional intuition. Of course, you do that. I don't mean vague emotional stuff. I mean a professional intuition where every doctor has that, who's highly accomplished in his field. Every therapist who gets to understand people develops that sensitivity. That's a very important thing. It goes beyond intellect. And one is looking for that in one's professional development, to have that sensitivity, to be able to fathom and intuit. In psychiatry, one of the things one is taught is when you respond to a patient in a psychiatric interaction, read your own emotions. If you feel uncomfortable, why? What in them is generating this in you? If you feel dislike for the person you're dealing with, why? What is it they're doing? What buttons are they pushing in you? And from that, you can make a diagnosis. Last question. Somebody says they're on medication. Yes, okay. The question of medication is a very important question. If you can cope with mental health issues without medication, of course you ought to do so. But many mental health situations are non-amenable to being handled without medication. And if Hashem put a medicine in the world, why not use it? The Rambam writes that a person who refuses to take listen to this. The Rambam, who was a doctor, writes that anyone who refuses to take a medication is as foolish as a person refusing food. I don't need food, God will take care of me. No. And if you say, I won't take the medication, God will take care of me. No, says the Rambam. That's what he writes. If you refuse a medication that is necessary, you're as foolish as a person refusing a food that is necessary. And if it's put into the world and it's part of the armamentarium that you can use to deal with the situation, what's the problem? Medication have side effects? Indeed. The Ramban says what heals one kills another. We don't claim that medicines are necessarily safe. We claim that they're better than the alternative, that's all. No one claims that a COVID vaccination, by the way, is guaranteed to be safe. We don't know. We don't know. There may be. I expect there will be side effects down the line. Why not? There always are. The question is it worth the damage? Do we make a risk-benefit assessment at the moment, which leads us to a Torah acceptance of Shem Ipsaim Hashem based on the common practice? Then we do it, and it applies to mental health issues as well. Okay, David, it looks like I've dealt with the questions that came up on the screen, and I think we've exhausted our time. I remember, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm just trying to present, I think, a balanced and healthy, normal approach. Rabbi Zimmerman in London says COVID has led to the loss of three things: smell, taste, and common sense. Let's try to reestablish the common sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, you hear me? Okay, I want to first thank everybody for joining us. Of course, thank you to Rabbi Tatz. I don't know if he's on anymore to hear the thank you. I know my mother would have loved this lecture. But again, our point is that you should reach out to Avnei Chein, reach out as a volunteer, reach out as somebody who is in need of mental health guidance. Even if you can't afford a psychiatrist, there's lots of things that we can do to help. Our website is avneichein.org. Even if you spell it wrong, it'll probably come out right. But avneichein.org, you can actually see that on the actual notices about this event. You'll see Avnei Chein the way it's spelled. So please come forward, reach out. That's what we're trying to achieve tonight. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in the community and be able to help and continue to help as many people as possible. And thanks for the team for all being part of making this event work. And God willing, you'll hear a lot more about what we have to do in the future as well. Thank you so much.